Do you know what really annoys me as a podcast host? Getting pictures from people who've clearly never even listened to my show. It's like you want to get in front of my audience, the audience that I've worked really hard to grow, but you can't even be bothered to listen to the podcast or even just flick through the back episodes. Most podcast hosts I know have exactly the same complaint. The good news is that doing your research, so just listening to the show or even scrolling through the back episodes, puts you streets ahead of most people who are doing the pitching. So here's 10 more tips to help you pitch yourself as a podcast guest. Number 1, it's not about you. I get so many pitches from people telling me how brilliant they are and how good it would be for them to be on my show. But as a podcast host, what I'm really interested in is great content for my audience, content that my audience is going to love. So that is what you need to pitch. Number 2, label the subject header of your pitch email. Most podcast hosts are actively looking for guests for their show, so if you label the subject header of your email, they're much more likely to pay attention. Number 3, pitch a specific idea for the show and do it in your subject header. Most podcast pitches I get say something like, if you're doing something on social media, I can help. Not very helpful, right? As a podcast host, I want people to pitch ideas that are really great for my audience, specific show ideas, things I haven't covered before. So if you can do that and you can do it in your subject header, I'm much more likely to say yes to you. But don't try to be clever with words. If you take my pet subject, getting featured in the press, as an example, it would be really tempting to pitch something like making the news or making the headlines, but that won't mean anything to a busy podcast host. So if you're offering to give an interview on how to get press coverage, that's exactly what you should say in your subject header. Number 4, keep your introduction brief. If you're pitching cold, then it's a good idea to introduce yourself. But don't spend too long on this, otherwise you could lose the podcast host's attention before you've even got started. Number 5, show that you've actually listened to the podcast. So it's a good idea to show that you've listened to the podcast, perhaps mention a recent episode that you really enjoyed in your pitch. Number 6, show that you can add value to their audience. The more specific you can be about the content that you're going to cover and how it could help their audience, the more likely you'll be to get a yes. Number 7, show how you can help them grow their audience. If you want to increase your chances of getting a yes, then you need to show the podcast host how you can help them grow their audience, how you're going to help get that content in front of more people. So sharing stats about your social media followers, your email list, your influence, that can all be really useful. If you're just starting out and you don't have an audience yet, then don't let that hold you back from pitching yourself as a podcast guest. Just really focus on adding value with the content. Number 8, show that other people value your content. If you've been a podcast guest on another show or you've written some guest content, then do mention that in your pitch, because that will reassure the podcast host that you really know what you're talking about. Number 9, make it as easy as possible for them to say yes to you. For most podcast hosts, the interview is the enjoyable bit. What we don't enjoy quite so much is chasing you up for your photo, for your website address, for your social media handles. So if you can provide that in your pitch email, then you're saving them a job and they're much more likely to say yes to you. Number 10, don't forget to follow up. Spending half an hour on a podcast interview with someone you really admire or would like to build a relationship with is a really valuable thing. So when the podcast episode comes out, don't forget to follow up with them and say thanks, and also make sure you share it across all of your social media networks. That's all for today, but if you want more tips on how to promote yourself in the media, you may want to get hold of a copy of my book, Your Press Release is Breaking My Heart.